Tom Bower, the legendary royal author, for a new edition of his book set to reveal huge secrets inside Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's marriage.
Tom Bower just uncovered something buried inside Harry and Meghan's marriage that nobody was supposed to find. Buried on page 14 of a legal document Harry signed in 2020 is a single clause so devastating it could tear his entire life apart. His name destroyed, his brand gone, his relationship with his children fractured, his financial future wiped out completely. What makes this even more sickening is that Harry signed this document during one of the most emotionally broken periods of his life without fully reading a single word of it. That one blind signature has been quietly moving money behind the scenes since 2022. Now Tom Bower is screaming one warning at the top of his lungs. Harry needs to prepare to lose absolutely everything. The man who knew too much. Tom Bower spent years building one of the most explosive books ever written about the British royal family. When Revenge hit shelves, it detonated. Revenge accused Meghan Markle of systematically dismantling Harry's relationships with his family, manipulating palace staff, and running a ruthless campaign to reshape her own image while destroying the reputations of anyone who stood in her way. The book was furious, detailed, and meticulously sourced. And the reaction it triggered from Meghan's camp was so aggressive, so coordinated, and so desperate that it raised a question Bower could not stop thinking about. If the first book was this damaging, what was still out there that nobody had found yet? So he went back. Bower tracked down 80 people with direct first-hand access to Meghan's private world and asked them one simple question. What did you actually see? Who is Meghan behind the cameras? What they told him across interview after interview was a portrait of calculation so consistent and so cold, it almost feels impossible. And buried inside those 80 interviews were 3 accounts that changed everything. The first came from former palace staff who worked directly inside the Sussex household. What they described was not a difficult boss or a demanding employer. It was a control system so deliberate and so consistent that several of them used almost identical language when they spoke to Bower, despite never having spoken to each other. Meghan did not simply manage the household. She controlled every piece of information that reached Harry. Messages from his family, contact from his oldest friends, concerns raised by staff members. All of it passed through a filter she maintained and operated. One former aide told Bower directly that Harry lived inside a version of reality that Meghan built and managed for him every single day. By the time anyone outside that bubble tried to reach Harry with a different version of events, he had already been prepared to reject it. Staff members who raised concerns internally were not given warnings or formal reviews. They were removed from their positions with a speed that multiple former employees described as unlike anything they had ever seen before. The second account came from Hollywood professionals who worked with Meghan. Multiple sources described the same pattern without ever speaking to each other. She would build an intensely close working relationship with a collaborator, present herself as deeply loyal, and then cut that person off the moment their usefulness ran out. One senior production figure had even put the pattern in writing, filing a formal internal warning that Meghan's relationship with professional loyalty was so transactional, it would eventually produce serious consequences. The third finding is the one Bower himself calls the most significant discovery across all 80 interviews. A legal professional with direct first-hand knowledge of the Sussex financial arrangements told Bower that as early as 2019, separate financial structures were already being discussed internally, structures that would give Meghan independent control over revenue generated by the Sussex brand. Not in 2022, when the marriage began showing public fractures. Not after Megxit, when the pressures of a new life in California created obvious strain. This was in 2019. The couple were still inside the royal family. The love story was still being performed in front of the cameras, and behind it, the financial exit architecture was already being drawn up and put in place. Tom Bower is a former barrister and BBC investigative journalist with over 40 years of experience going after powerful people who believed they could not be touched. He exposed Robert Maxwell, the media tycoon who stole hundreds of millions from his own employees' pension funds while hiding behind an army of lawyers. He went inside Mohammed al-Fayed's business empire and dragged out what al-Fayed had spent enormous resources keeping buried. He dismantled Simon Cowell's operation from the inside. Bauer does not publish on instinct. He builds cases the exact same way he built them as a practicing lawyer, using documents, timelines, and multiple sources cross-referenced against each other until the cracks split wide open. Which is why the response his first book triggered is itself one of the most revealing parts of this entire story. Meghan's legal team filed for a formal injunction to block the book before a single copy reached a single reader. That injunction failed completely. Her team then sent formal written complaints at 3 of Bauer's sources, arguing that their participation violated confidentiality agreements. 2 of those 3 sources went silent immediately. The third refused to back down, but the pressure went far beyond formal letters. Sources described being contacted repeatedly by individuals they believed were acting directly on Meghan's behalf. They were reminded of the non-disclosure agreements they had signed years earlier and told in plain, direct language that continuing to cooperate with Bauer would cost them far more than any book was worth. One source told Bauer's team the experience felt less like a legal process and more like being shown exactly how much of their life could be destroyed if they kept talking. Bauer published anyway. He absorbed every assault, watched 2 sources fold under the pressure, and published anyway. The fact that he has returned for a second edition with full knowledge of exactly what is coming at him again tells you with complete clarity how solid he believes this new material to be. Because what he found this time is buried on page 14 of a document Harry signed in 2020, and it is the piece that makes everything else finally make sense. But to understand why that clause exists, why Meghan knew exactly what language to put in it, and precisely when to place it in front of Harry, you have to go back much further to Meghan's first marriage before Harry ever entered the picture. Meghan had done this before. Most people barely remember Trevor Engelson, Meghan's ex-husband. He was a Hollywood television producer who met Meghan when she was still a struggling actress trying to find her footing in the industry. They dated for years and got married in Jamaica in 2011 with their closest friends around them. Then 2 years later, Meghan filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The whole thing was quiet, clean, and over so fast it barely registered as news. But what happened inside that settlement tells you almost everything you need to know about what came next. When Meghan sat down with her legal team to negotiate the split from Trevor, the lawyers on his side were not prepared for what they encountered. She had not walked in with one lawyer. Meghan had walked in with a team. She had read every line of every document before the first meeting. She questioned every clause and pushed back on every term that did not directly serve her long-term financial independence. What almost nobody has reported is the specific financial arrangement inside that divorce that Meghan later used as a direct template. According to people who know Engelson personally, Meghan's team inserted a clause into the agreement that gave her full ownership of any future earnings derived from projects she had developed during the marriage, even if those projects had not yet generated income at the time of the split. Engelson realized only months after the divorce was finalized that this clause had cut him out of several projects he had actively helped develop. He described the experience to a close friend, according to Bauer's sources, as opening a door he thought led to one room and finding out it led somewhere else entirely. The same structural logic and forward ownership over future earning potential appears almost verbatim in the 2020 prenup amendment Meghan later got Harry to sign. The lesson she took out of her first marriage was one she never forgot. Protect your earning potential above everything else. Walk away with nothing that ties you to another person's decisions. A complete break that leaves you fully independent and in control of whatever comes next. What Meghan also learned during that divorce was something far darker. The person who controls the story controls the outcome. When the split from Trevor became public, She managed the framing with a precision that her own friends described as unsettling. Trevor was not painted as a villain. He was simply erased. Within a year, most people who followed her career could not have told you his name. Meghan did not destroy him. She made him irrelevant. The estrangement from her father, Thomas Markle, belongs inside this same pattern, and it goes darker than the public version of events. What has never been fully reported is that in the months before the royal wedding, Meghan's legal team issued Thomas Markle a formal written communication advising him that any media contact or public statement would be treated as a violation of a confidentiality arrangement he had allegedly agreed to. Thomas Markle has claimed publicly that he never signed any such agreement, but the existence of that legal communication, reported by a source close to the Markle family, suggests that steps were being taken to legally neutralize him before he had even done anything publicly damaging. A man with press contacts and an unpredictable personality was neutralized before the wedding and erased from Meghan's story the same way Trevor Engelson had been erased years before. It was around this same period that Bowers researchers uncovered something that reframes the entire timeline of what followed. When Meghan began dating Harry in 2016, she did not wait to see where the relationship was going before making moves. She hired Sunshine Sachs almost immediately, not months into the relationship or after the engagement. And Sunshine Sachs is not a firm you hire because you are excited about a new romance. The company has built its reputation on handling a very specific kind of work: crisis management and high-stakes separations. They are known for protecting celebrity brands during some of the most volatile and high-pressure moments of their lives. They managed Katie Holmes when she left Tom Cruise. When a woman entering a fresh relationship with a prince hires a firm like that on day one, she is not thinking about the honeymoon. She is thinking about the exit. By the time Prince Harry slipped the engagement ring onto Meghan Markle's finger, she had already been following the same approach for years. She maintained her own income, cultivated an independent identity, and established financial arrangements that did not depend on anyone else. She also had a crisis management firm on retainer and a consistent pattern of ending relationships as soon as they became inconvenient, a strategy that had always served to protect her. Harry did not know any of this. He was dazzled, broken, and completely certain he had finally found the one person who truly understood him. He had no idea the woman standing beside him had already begun thinking about how to structure the exit. And by the time the wedding was over and the cameras were gone, the groundwork had already been laid for everything that followed. But to understand what Harry signed in 2020, you first need to understand how royal prenuptial agreements actually work, because they are nothing like the agreements most people have seen. Page 14, Clause 7. A standard prenuptial agreement is relatively simple. It lists what each person brings into the marriage and explains how shared property would be divided if the couple separates. But royal prenuptial agreements operate on an entirely different level. They are designed to protect assets that belong not to the couple, but to the crown itself. They cover properties held in trust for future generations, rules about the use of royal titles after a separation, and detailed language governing public behavior and what can and cannot be said about the family in the press. These are not casual documents. They are legal architectures designed to control image, assets, and long-term outcomes for decades. When Harry and Meghan signed their original prenuptial agreement before the 2018 wedding, it was built to navigate the collision between that royal framework and California law. Under California's community property rules, anything earned during a marriage is considered jointly owned by both spouses. That includes streaming deals, media contracts, brand revenue, and money generated from any business launched after the wedding date. The original prenup attempted to set boundaries around this, but it was the amendment signed in 2020 that dismantled every protection Harry thought he had. What almost nobody has reported is the specific window in which Harry signed that amendment. According to a source with direct knowledge of the timeline, the document was placed in front of Harry within days of the formal announcement that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex were stepping back from royal duties. Harry was at that precise moment dealing with the simultaneous collapse of his royal identity. a public rupture with his brother, the removal of his security detail, and the terrifying reality of having no income and no defined role for the first time in his entire life. Mental health professionals who have analyzed his public statements describe this period as one of acute psychological crises. His legal team at the time was almost entirely focused on his media lawsuits in the UK. His California legal representation was less experienced with the specific implications of prenuptial amendments under California law. The amendment was presented to him as routine paperwork, a standard update to reflect their new business activities. Harry trusted Meghan completely, so he signed it. But he had no idea what he had just given away. What Harry signed was an intellectual property clause buried on page 14 of that amendment. Intellectual property covers a very broad range of things. It includes brand names, logos, and trademarks. It includes the rights to stories, books, and media content. It includes the right to profit from a person's own name and likeness. It even includes revenue streams connected to any content built around a person's public identity. This clause did not simply divide those things equally. According to Bauer's sources, it gave Meghan primary ownership over the Sussex brand, their joint ventures, their media content, and the revenue connected to Harry's memoir, Spare. It listed her as the business manager for all their shared enterprises, which under California law gives her the dominant legal position in any financial dispute. But Bauer describes one element of this clause as the real knife in the agreement. It does not simply cover existing joint ventures. It contains forward-looking language that covers any future project developed using assets, relationships, or platforms that originated during the marriage. What this means in practice is that even if Harry walked away tomorrow, started completely afresh, and built something entirely new, if that new venture drew in any way on his royal background, his Invictus platform, his public profile as a Sussex, or any relationship formed during the marriage, Meghan would have a legal claim to a share of it. It is not just a divorce clause, it is a financial leash with no expiry date. The name Harry was born with and the life he actually lived could become, in legal terms, largely hers to control. Bauer also identified where the language came from. The same lawyers who handled Meghan's divorce from Trevor Engelson were consulted during the drafting of this amendment. They had already seen her operate. They already knew what she prioritized, and they built a clause that reflected with devastating precision the lesson Meghan had carried out of her first marriage and spent years waiting to deploy at scale. Harry signed it at the worst moment of his life, surrounded by almost no one he could trust, with no independent legal voice telling him to stop. He signed because she asked him to. And by the time the ink was dry, the trap had closed completely. The clause alone was enough to change everything. But the clause on paper only matters if the financial architecture around it is built to match. And while Harry was publicly unraveling across the following years, fighting court cases in London and weeping in front of judges, Meghan was back in California quietly and systematically, building an empire designed from its very foundation to survive the end of the marriage and leave him with almost nothing. The empire she built alone. By 2022, something had shifted between Harry and Meghan. Anyone paying attention close enough could feel it, even if they could not name it. Meghan stopped appearing with Harry at events, unless a contract required it. The joint interviews dried up. The unified public front began to crack. And while the press spent its energy speculating about marital tension, Meghan was doing something far more purposeful. She was filing paperwork. American Riviera Orchard appeared first. A lifestyle brand filed as a trademark application was under her name alone, with no reference to Harry anywhere in the documentation. No joint ownership, no shared filing. Then the podcast deal with Lemon Media arrived, and again it was structured with her listed as the sole proprietor. Even the family book The Bench was set up with no financial connection to Harry whatsoever. Every single business structure Meghan created during this period told the same story. She was not building a shared future with Harry. She was building a personal fortress. What almost no one has reported is the specific mechanism Bauer's sources say was used to move money out of jointly held structures into Meghan's solo accounts during this period. According to a financial advisor who spoke to Bauer, the method involved the creation of what are known in California as single-member LLCs. A single-member LLC is a limited liability company owned entirely by one person and treated as legally separate from any marital estate. Meghan reportedly established multiple such entities during this period, each holding specific assets or revenue streams. Under California law, income directed into a single-member LLC before it is transferred to a joint account can be argued to remain the separate property of the LLC's sole owner. Bauer's sources identified at least 5 such entities established in Meghan's name alone between 2022 and 2024. Harry is not named in any of them. The Netflix deal gives the clearest window into how the money actually moved. Reported publicly as worth $100 million, it was never a guaranteed payment. Entertainment insiders explained to Bauer that the $100 million was the maximum possible payout if every single piece of contracted content was delivered in full. The documentary series and Meghan's cooking show was produced, but the animated series Pearl was canceled before it aired, and several other contracted projects never materialized. According to Bauer's sources, the actual amount received before Netflix downgraded the arrangement was approximately $40 million. The question Bauer pressed his sources on was where that $40 million went and how it was structured to flow. The reported $38 million debt figure connected to the Sussex finances is not what it appears to be. Most people who encountered that number assumed reckless spending, but Bauer's financial sources described something far more calculated. A significant portion of that debt is structured so that the liabilities appear jointly held while the actual financial burden attaches more heavily to Harry's side. The mechanism involves personal guarantees. When a couple co-signs debt, California courts look at who derived the primary economic benefit from the spending. If Meghan can demonstrate that the expenditures were primarily related to Harry's legal cases, his international travel, and his personal projects rather than their shared business ventures, courts could assign a disproportionate share of that debt to him. Bauer says this is not accidental. The spending pattern from 2022 onward was structured to create exactly that outcome. Every advisor he spoke to described it using the same word: textbook. By 2023, every structure was fully in place. The trademarks were secured, the business registrations were filed, the legal protections were locked into position, and Meghan's name appeared first on every official document connected to Archewell, giving her the dominant legal authority over decision-making at the exact moment it would matter most. Harry, meanwhile, was in London. He was sitting in courtrooms arguing with judges, weeping openly, and spending money on legal battles his own team had warned were financially catastrophic. Bauer's sources raised a question about this particular period that is genuinely chilling. They asked why Meghan continued to encourage those UK legal battles even after Harry's lawyers had clearly briefed him on the financial exposure. The answer his sources suggested was this: under the prenuptial amendment, those legal debts would fall on Harry alone once the divorce was filed. Meghan had no reason to stop him. She had every reason to let him keep going. Meghan had built the fortress. She had secured the assets. She had structured the liabilities to land on him, and now there was only one thing left to do. She needed to control the story before anyone else could tell it. So she made a phone call to a firm she had worked with before, a firm that knew exactly how to shape a narrative in the months before everything went public. And the moment that call was made, the final phase began. The endgame. In January 2026, Meghan rehired Sunshine Sachs. On the surface, it looked like a routine business decision, a celebrity bringing back a familiar PR firm. The kind of move that happens in Hollywood every week without attracting much attention. But people who understand how high-profile divorce strategy actually works described it to Bauer as anything but routine. You do not bring in a crisis management firm that specializes in separations unless the separation is already decided. You bring them in 3 to 6 months before filing, so that by the time the papers are served, the public already has a version of events that makes you look like the victim and your spouse look like the problem. The story planted in those months before filing is the story that sticks. It shapes how the custody battle is framed. It shapes what the audience believes before a single court document is made public. What has never been reported anywhere is the specific advice Meghan allegedly received from a senior Hollywood divorce attorney in late 2020, one that shaped everything that followed. According to a source close to that attorney, Meghan was advised that the single most effective way to secure a dominant legal position in a California divorce involving a public figure spouse was to establish herself as the primary commercial driver of the partnership before any separation occurred. California courts look at who built the business. If one spouse can demonstrate they were the architect of the commercial enterprise, the creative force, the deal maker, and the public face of the brand, that spouse enters any asset dispute from a position of enormous strength. Every move Meghan made from 2022 onward, the solo filings, the independent ventures, the decision to front all public-facing media, aligns precisely with that advice. Bauer was precise about the legal timeline. California family law requires 6 months of residency before a divorce petition can be filed. Meghan had been a permanent California resident for years. Bauer's sources told him she could file within 6 months of January 2026, and the moment she files, everything assembled since 2020 activates at once. The intellectual property clause on page 14 kicks in. The asset structures Meghan built between 2022 and 2023 lock into place. The trademarks, the business registrations, the financial flows routed away from jointly held entities, all of it becomes the legal framework a California court will use to determine what belongs to whom. And Harry will walk into that courtroom with almost none of the protections he thought he had. Bauer's portrait of Harry across this entire period is the part of the story that lands the hardest, because it is not a portrait of a foolish man or a weak one. It is a portrait of a completely destroyed one. Harry entered this marriage already broken in ways that most people cannot fully imagine. His mother died violently when he was 12 years old, and the royal family's response was to suppress his grief and train him to perform composure for cameras. He spent decades carrying that damage while being handed a ceremonial role that gave him no real purpose and no real identity. The dependency he developed on external validation was so deep and total that people around him described it to Bauer as something closer to an open wound than a personality trait. And Meghan, from the very beginning, understood that wound and used it to manipulate him. Former Kensington Palace staff described to Bauer a marriage where Meghan controlled the information environment around Harry completely. Old friends who reached out described the eerie experience of getting through to him briefly, and then watching him pull away again within days, as though something had been said to him in private that changed his mind. Every person who might have pushed back, who might have asked him a difficult question, who might have shown him a different version of reality, was removed. By the time Megxit happened, Harry had no inner circle left except her. He was alone in a country that was not his own, and financially dependent on a woman whose exit strategy had been running for years. Former household staff described to Bauer a marriage that had been fracturing in private long before any of it appeared in public. There were shouting loud enough to be heard through closed doors and stretches of silence lasting for days. Harry's behavior in the London courtrooms, the arguments with judges, the raw and open breakdowns, was not the behavior of a man with a secure home waiting for him. That was the behavior of a man who already knew at some deep and wordless level that something was catastrophically wrong and could not find the edges of it. The custody dimension is the part that sources close to Harry describe as the most devastating element of all. Under California family law, courts establish custody arrangements based primarily on the existing pattern of care at the time of filing. Harry has spent a significant portion of the last 3 years outside California, traveling to the UK for court cases and attending Invictus events internationally. While Meghan has remained in California, present in the children's daily lives, serving as the primary caregiver in practical terms, regardless of whatever private arrangement exists between them. Bauer's sources say that when divorce papers are filed, Meghan's legal team will immediately submit documentation of Harry's absence pattern as evidence supporting her application for primary custody. What Bauer ultimately predicts for Harry is not just a divorce. It is a complete dismantling. He loses the Montecito mansion under the asset structures already in place. He loses majority control of Archewell and the Sussex brand under the intellectual property clause he signed without reading. He faces a custody fight he is already losing. And under the forward-looking language on page 14, the right to monetize his own royal identity, to write another book, to launch another project built on the story of who he actually is, could belong largely to her for years to come. Harry signed away his name, his brand, his children's primary home, and his financial future. He signed it at the single most broken and isolated moment of his adult life because Meghan placed it in front of him, and he had no one left to tell him to stop. By the time Harry fully understands the scope of what he gave away, the legal machinery will already be in motion, and it will be far too late to change any of it. The clause would have been activated. The assets would have been separated. The narrative, shaped and planted by Sunshine Sachs across the months before filing, will already be the version of events the world believes. And Harry, the man who gave up everything for a love story, will be left holding the wreckage of a plan he never knew existed.